the 16th of May, 1990. A gunshot inside Marlon Brando's Beverly Hills home left a 26-year-old man dead. The shooter was his own son. By then, Brando had won 2 Oscars and starred in a $245 million global phenomenon, playing the most powerful father in cinema history. Now he stood outside a courtroom, watching his 2-year-old son face a murder charge. How does the man who ruled every scene lose control of his own family? 18 years before that courtroom, Marlon Brando had just reclaimed his throne. In 1972, The Godfather grossed over $245 million worldwide and became the highest-earning film of its time. Brando, at 48, won his second Academy Award for playing Don Vito Corleone, the ultimate patriarch, a man who protected his family at any cost. On screen, he controlled every conversation with a whisper. Every decision revolved around loyalty and blood. A man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man. The line became legend. Off-screen, Brando had at least 11 children with multiple women. Relationships overlapped. Homes were scattered across Los Angeles, Tahiti, and beyond. The structure was fluid. The boundaries unclear. In 1990, that private chaos became public. Christian Brando was charged with killing Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of his half-sister Cheyenne. 5 years later, Cheyenne died by suicide at 25. The actor who defined power and family for generations could not prevent his own from collapsing. Was Don Corleone the role of a lifetime, or the mask that hid everything falling apart behind it? Before the courtroom, before the Oscars. Before Don Corleone ever existed, there was a child trying to understand why love felt unstable. Marlon Brando was born on the 3rd of April, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska. His father was disciplined, critical, emotionally distant. His mother was talented, creative, and deeply alcoholic. Some nights she was affectionate and inspiring. Other nights she disappeared into drinking, leaving silence behind. For a child, inconsistency becomes confusion. Brando grew up without a steady emotional center. His father demanded strength but offered little warmth. Approval came rarely and usually with conditions. Affection was unpredictable. Security was temporary. He later described feeling invisible in his own home. When he sought recognition, he often received correction instead. When he showed vulnerability, he was met with indifference. Over time, he learned 2 lessons quietly. First, do not rely on authority for comfort. Second, find attention elsewhere. School became a battleground. He challenged teachers. He resisted discipline. At 16, he was sent to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota. The environment emphasized obedience and structure. Brando reacted with defiance. He violated rules, clashed with instructors, and was eventually expelled. Authority did not calm him. It triggered resistance. But rebellion was only part of the story. Beneath it was longing. His mother, despite her addiction, loved theater. She introduced him to performance and local productions. On stage, Brando felt something different. The room listened. Applause replaced silence. For the first time, attention felt earned rather than begged for. Acting offered control. In performance, emotion followed structure. Pain could be expressed safely. Anger could be shaped into dialogue. Vulnerability could receive applause instead of dismissal. What was chaotic at home became organized under stage lights. When he moved to New York in his late teens, he carried this understanding with him. At the dramatic workshop and later under Stella Adler, he refined it. Adler taught him that acting required emotional truth. Not imitation, not surface gestures, but memory. Draw from lived experience. Use real wounds. Brando did exactly that. The insecurity rooted in his father's criticism, the instability of a mother who loved but could not protect herself, the loneliness of not feeling consistently held, these became material. On screen and stage, audiences saw raw authenticity. They believed him because he was not inventing emotion. He was revisiting it. Yet there is a difference between expressing pain and resolving it. Brando learned to channel childhood instability into performance, But he did not necessarily replace that instability with a new model of structure. He mastered emotional intensity. He did not practice emotional steadiness. As adulthood approached, the patterns remained. He valued independence. He distrusted rigid systems. He resisted control in relationships, just as he had resisted it in school. Stability felt constricting. Freedom felt safer. These traits fueled his artistic innovation. They also complicated intimacy. A child raised in unpredictability often grows into an adult who normalizes unpredictability. What feels chaotic to others can feel familiar. What feels stable can feel uncomfortable. By the time fame arrived in the early 1950s, Brando was already shaped by these early dynamics. He was brilliant, perceptive, emotionally expressive. He was also wary of attachment and skeptical of permanence. Family, in his formative years, had been a place of love mixed with volatility, structure mixed with criticism, affection mixed with absence. If that was the template he absorbed, what kind of family structure would he build later when fame amplified every flaw and magnified every weakness? The boy who searched for stability found power on stage. But power does not automatically repair a fractured foundation. And if the foundation remains unsettled, how long can the structure above it truly hold? When Marlon Brando arrived in New York in the mid-1940s, he was not chasing fame, he was chasing intensity. Acting offered him something precise, a way to control emotion by performing it. Under Stella Adler's guidance, he embraced method acting completely. He was taught to draw from lived memory, to feel rather than demonstrate, to allow silence to carry as much weight as dialogue. This approach did not polish him, it exposed him. In 1951, A Streetcar Named Desire exploded onto the screen. As Stanley Kowalski, Brando did not resemble traditional leading men. He was raw, physical, unpredictable. His voice carried both threat and vulnerability. Audiences were stunned. Critics struggled to categorize him. Hollywood adjusted overnight. Masculinity on screen shifted from controlled and composed to volatile and human. 3 years later, On the Waterfront sealed his transformation from rising talent to generational force. He won his first Academy Award in 1955 at age 30. The line, "I could have been a contender," became cinematic shorthand for regret and lost potential. The performance was intimate, almost confessional. Viewers felt they were watching a man relive something real. With fame came access, attention, and temptation. Brando entered relationships intensely and exited them just as quickly. He married 3 times. He had children with multiple partners across different countries. The structure of his personal life reflected the same impulsiveness that energized his performances. Stability was rarely prioritized. Emotional intensity was. Hollywood elevated him to the highest tier of celebrity. He became one of the highest-paid actors of the 1950s. Studios built projects around him. His name guaranteed financing. But as his professional influence expanded, his private world grew increasingly complex. Homes existed in Los Angeles, Tahiti, and elsewhere. Partners and children moved in overlapping orbits. He valued freedom deeply. He resisted routine. He disliked being told where to be and when. That independence fueled his artistry but complicated parenthood. Children require consistency. Fame demands mobility. Brando's life leaned toward the latter. He was capable of extraordinary tenderness in interviews and on film. He could speak about vulnerability with clarity, yet consistency requires repetition, not intensity. It requires presence over time, not emotional peaks. As his children grew older, they did so inside a reality shaped by global celebrity. Their father was admired publicly and physically absent for long stretches. They inherited his last name along with its weight. Attention followed them. Expectations formed around them. Brando had learned to mine childhood instability for artistic depth. He had never fully replaced it with a stable framework of his own. On set, he commanded attention without raising his voice. In private life, he often withdrew when confronted with emotional demands. The difference between performing protection and practicing it quietly widened over time. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, he was no longer simply an actor, he was an institution. Yet inside that institution, his family life was not anchored by the kind of steady rhythm he himself had lacked growing up. He could create unforgettable fathers on screen. He could articulate loyalty and sacrifice with conviction. But building a cohesive household required a different skill set, one that could not be improvised. As his career accelerated toward even greater heights, the private structure beneath it remained fluid and fragile. If the foundation of his childhood was unstable, and adulthood amplified rather than corrected it, was the future already quietly moving toward collision? By the early 1970s, Marlon Brando was no longer just a celebrated actor. He was a reference point. Younger performers studied him. Directors adjusted scripts around him. His pauses carried more authority than other actors' speeches, yet the path to that renewed dominance had not been smooth. Throughout the 1960s, a series of expensive productions underperformed. Mutiny on the Bounty became synonymous with chaos and overspending. Studio executives questioned his reliability. Trade publications quietly labeled him difficult. For a period, the industry treated him as a risk rather than an asset. Then came 1972. The Godfather opened in March and quickly became a phenomenon. The film grossed over $245 million worldwide and reshaped American cinema. Brando, at 48, portrayed Don Vito Corleone with restrained intensity. He spoke softly, forcing audiences to lean in. He moved slowly, making stillness feel threatening. Every decision his character made centered on family loyalty and protection. He won his second Academy Award for Best Actor. 18 years had passed since his first win. The comeback was undeniable. Hollywood embraced him again, this time as a patriarch of the industry itself. The role carried layered irony. Don Corleone was defined by order. He demanded discipline, loyalty, silence. His authority held the family together. Even betrayal operated within structure. On screen, Brando embodied a father whose presence stabilized chaos. Off-screen, his own family life was increasingly dispersed. By that point, he had children living in different households, with different mothers, across different geographies. Some lived in Los Angeles. Others in Tahiti. Communication flowed unevenly. Emotional bonds varied in strength and consistency. Public perception rarely captured that complexity. The image was simpler. He was the most powerful father in film history. He was the man who delivered lines about loyalty and respect that echoed across decades. The public conflated performance with identity. Fame amplified the contradiction. Red carpets presented a composed legend. Interviews highlighted his influence on modern acting. Magazines celebrated his mystique. Meanwhile, the logistics of managing a large, scattered family required sustained attention that celebrity life rarely allowed. Brando understood emotional nuance better than most performers of his generation. He could read a script and detect psychological shifts instantly. Yet emotional literacy in art does not guarantee structural stability at home. The spotlight intensified after The Godfather. Offers increased. His cultural capital soared. He became both a symbol of cinematic revolution and a living monument. Expectations followed him everywhere. For children growing up in that environment, the experience was complex. Their father was admired by millions, yet physically unavailable for long stretches due to filming schedules and travel. They inherited a last name associated with genius and volatility. They entered adulthood under the weight of public fascination. The distance between image and interior reality widened quietly. The peak of his professional power coincided with a fragile private ecosystem that relied heavily on emotional resilience. That resilience was not evenly distributed. Don Corleone protected his family through control. Marlon Brando valued freedom above control. The distinction mattered. As his cultural influence reached historic heights, the private structure beneath it remained delicate. The world saw authority, command, legacy. Inside the family sphere, unresolved patterns from childhood continued shaping interaction. He had mastered presence on screen. He had reshaped the definition of masculinity in film. He had reclaimed his throne in Hollywood at 48. But as the applause intensified and the legend solidified, was the foundation at home quietly weakening beyond repair? By 1990, the image was still intact. Marlon Brando was a two-time Oscar winner, the face of a $245 million global phenomenon, and widely regarded as the most influential screen actor of his generation. On posters, he embodied control. In interviews, he spoke with measured authority. Inside his family, the structure was far more fragile. Brando had at least 11 children with multiple women. Some relationships were affectionate but distant. Others were complicated by resentment, jealousy, or emotional volatility. The family did not operate from a single home or rhythm. It stretched across Los Angeles, Tahiti, and beyond. Different mothers, different expectations, different experiences of the same father. Christian Brando, born in 1958, grew up in the center of that complexity. He was the son of an icon, raised under constant media attention. Reports over the years described behavioral issues, struggles with drugs, and instability. Being Brando's son came with pressure and privilege at the same time. Cheyenne Brando, born in 1970, grew up partly in Tahiti. Sensitive and emotionally vulnerable, she reportedly struggled with depression and identity. The weight of the Brando name did not come with a manual for stability. On the 16th of May, 1990, everything that had been private became public. Inside the Brando family home on Mulholland Drive, Christian shot and killed Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of Cheyenne, during an argument. Drolet was 26 years old. Christian was 32. The incident happened in the same house where a legendary actor had hosted guests, rehearsed lines, and raised children under the shadow of global fame. Police cars surrounded the property. Media helicopters circled above. The name Brando shifted from film pages to crime headlines overnight. Christian claimed the shooting was accidental during a confrontation over Cheyenne's alleged mistreatment. Prosecutors charged him with murder. Cameras followed Marlon Brando as he entered court. He looked heavier, slower, visibly exhausted. The man who once controlled scenes with silence now stood silently in a courtroom, facing a system he could not outmaneuver. During the trial, Brando took the witness stand. He described his son as troubled but not malicious. He spoke about the pressures of fame and fractured family life. The testimony felt less like a performance and more like exposure. Christian eventually pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to prison. For the public, the narrative was stark. The greatest father figure in cinema history could not prevent violence in his own home. For Brando, the collapse was more intimate. He had built a career on understanding psychological nuance. He could dissect motivation, fear, loyalty. Yet inside his own household, conflict escalated beyond dialogue into tragedy. The difference between performance and presence became unavoidable. On screen, he rehearsed. In life, he reacted. Cheyenne's emotional state deteriorated after the shooting. She struggled with depression and isolation. The court case intensified her instability. In 1995, at age 25, she died by suicide. Two catastrophic events within 5 years. No role could buffer that reality. No applause could dilute it. Observers began asking a question that cut deeper than scandal. Had Brando's devotion to artistic freedom come at the cost of consistent fatherhood? Or were these tragedies the result of forces larger than one man's presence? The internal collapse was not sudden. It was cumulative. Childhood instability passed forward. Fame magnified it. Emotional intensity replaced structure. The public saw a legend. The private sphere absorbed consequences. Was this the inevitable outcome of a life built on emotional extremes, or the moment when the myth of control finally shattered beyond repair? After the sentencing, the cameras did not disappear. They multiplied. Every court appearance, every statement, every movement of the Brando family became public material. The man who had once used silence as power now faced a silence that offered no control. Christian served his sentence, but the damage extended beyond prison walls. The Brando name, once synonymous with cinematic revolution, became attached to tragedy. Interviews from that period show Marlon Brando speaking more slowly, more heavily. He admitted feeling responsible. He acknowledged that his children had grown up inside instability. Cheyenne's death in 1995 marked a second fracture that could not be framed as accident. She had struggled publicly with depression and substance abuse. She had spoken about feeling abandoned. When news of her suicide spread, headlines no longer focused on Oscar wins or iconic roles. They focused on failure, on loss, on a father unable to protect his daughter. Grief is not cinematic. It does not resolve in 2 hours. It lingers. Friends later described Brando as increasingly withdrawn. He gained more weight. He avoided public events. The defiant energy that once fueled political gestures and confrontations with studios softened into fatigue. He had challenged Hollywood. He had reshaped acting. But the private reckoning required a different kind of confrontation. There was no audience to convince, no script to refine, no director to negotiate with. There was only the reality that his family had fractured under pressures he could not stabilize. The irony became impossible to ignore. Don Corleone believed family was everything. He maintained order through authority and proximity. Brando valued freedom and distance. He resisted control, even within relationships. What protected his artistry may have weakened his household. In interviews during the late 1990s, Brando spoke about fame as a distortion. He suggested that celebrity isolates rather than connects. He admitted that success does not teach someone how to be present. These were not lines delivered in character. They were reflections stripped of performance. The internal collapse did not erase his legacy. It complicated it. He remained a towering figure in cinema, studied in acting schools and honored by peers. Yet beneath that recognition was a man confronting regret. The father who had once seemed mythic now appeared human, burdened, flawed. 2 Academy Awards, a career that changed modern acting, a family marked by prison and suicide. When the lights dimmed and the applause faded, what remained was not a character, but a man facing the consequences of patterns formed decades earlier. Did genius amplify what was already fragile, or did it simply expose the fractures that had always been there? After 1995, Marlon Brando no longer stood at the center of spectacle. He stood at the edge of it. The tragedies had altered him. Interviews from the late 1990s reveal a man less interested in myth and more willing to acknowledge limitation. He spoke openly about regret. He admitted that fame distorts perception, that success can create distance instead of closeness. There was no defiance in his tone, only fatigue. Professionally, he continued to appear in select roles, but the intensity of ambition had shifted. He no longer chased legacy. He already had it. What remained was survival, emotional, and physical. Health problems accumulated. His weight increased significantly. He battled diabetes and heart complications. Public appearances became rare. This was not a dramatic comeback arc. It was quieter. Brando began reframing how he viewed his own career. He described acting as a job rather than a sacred calling. He criticized the illusion of celebrity he had once embodied. He acknowledged that applause does not repair personal damage. For decades, he had resisted authority and challenged systems. Now the confrontation was internal. He could not out-argue grief. He could not improvise around regret. The only available response was reflection. Friends described him as more contemplative during these later years. He spent time in Tahiti, away from cameras. He maintained contact with some of his children and grandchildren, attempting a steadier presence than before. The scale was smaller, but the intention clearer. This period marked a different kind of rebirth. Not a return to dominance, but a retreat into awareness. He had spent his life portraying powerful men, leaders, fathers, figures whose words altered destinies. In private, he now faced the limits of his own influence. No script could reverse the past. No audience could absorb the weight of personal loss for him. Yet something remained intact. His artistic influence deepened rather than faded. Actors like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino continued citing him as foundational. Film schools dissected his performances frame by frame. His approach to vulnerability became the standard rather than the exception. He had transformed acting permanently. That achievement stood independent of personal collapse. The turning point, then, was not redemption in the traditional sense. It was acceptance. Acceptance that brilliance does not guarantee balance. Acceptance that freedom has consequences. Acceptance that love requires consistency, not intensity. In stepping back from public life, he removed the pressure to perform strength. The world could debate his choices. He no longer needed to defend them. This quieter version of Brando did not seek to shock or provoke. He had done that already. Instead, he occupied space more modestly, aware that the greatest battles were not fought on stage or screen but within relationships. If his early life had been defined by instability and his middle years by dominance, his later years were defined by reckoning. The myth of control had dissolved. What remained was human complexity, flawed, reflective, unfinished. Was this retreat a surrender, or the first honest role he ever played without an audience? In his final years, Marlon Brando was no longer surrounded by premieres or award ceremonies. He lived mostly in seclusion, dividing time between Los Angeles and Tahiti. His health declined steadily. Diabetes, heart disease, and respiratory issues limited his movement. The physical transformation from the lean, magnetic Stanley Kowalski of 1951 to the heavy, aging man of the early 2000s was stark. Yet his cultural presence never disappeared. Film retrospectives continued to revisit A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, The Godfather, and Apocalypse Now. Critics consistently ranked him among the most influential actors in cinema history. Acting teachers used his performances as case studies in emotional realism. Younger actors cited him as the point where modern screen acting began. His legacy in art was secure, but the conversation around his life remained layered. The tragedies within his family were never fully separated from the legend. Profiles written near the end of his life described both genius and grief. He was remembered not only for revolutionary performances, but also for a private history that resisted simplification. Brando himself often dismissed the idea of immortality through fame. He once remarked that celebrity was an illusion created by repetition. Yet the repetition continued. His scenes were replayed. His pauses were studied. His influence extended into generations he would never meet. He had reshaped masculinity on screen. He had made vulnerability acceptable in male protagonists. He had shown that silence could be more commanding than volume. These contributions altered the grammar of film, and still the contradiction endured. On screen, he portrayed fathers who commanded loyalty and preserved structure. In life, he navigated a family marked by fragmentation and loss. The public image and private outcome never fully aligned. When he died on the 1st of July 2004, at age 80, tributes poured in from around the world. Directors, actors, critics all acknowledged that cinema had been divided into before and after Brando. His impact was not theoretical. It was visible in every performance that prioritized authenticity over polish. But beyond the accolades, his story carried a quieter lesson. Talent can revolutionize an art form. It cannot automatically heal inherited instability. Fame can amplify a voice. It cannot guarantee presence. His legacy remains complex because it is human. The world remembers Don Corleone. The industry remembers the method pioneer. History remembers the Oscar winner. But what remains when applause fades and headlines settle? Is legacy defined by influence on culture, or by the lives shaped within the walls of one's own home? In 1990, cameras captured Marlon Brando entering a courtroom, not a premiere. The applause had been replaced by silence. The role was no longer written. The outcome was no longer controlled. For decades, he had mastered emotional truth on screen. He had embodied fathers, leaders, men whose authority anchored entire narratives. Audiences believed in his strength because he made it believable. But life does not follow scripts. The tragedies within his family revealed a different truth, that understanding emotion does not equal mastering it, and that presence cannot be improvised. Brando changed cinema permanently. That achievement stands unchallenged. Yet his personal story complicates the myth of artistic genius as total power. He once proved that vulnerability could redefine masculinity. In the end, his own vulnerability became unavoidable. The question that lingers is not whether he was a great actor. History has answered that. The question is quieter and more difficult. Can a man command the screen and still struggle to command his own life? And if greatness in art does not guarantee stability at home, what does real strength truly look like?